Session. My name is Ben Lawson. I'm with Burk I.T. We are here to talk today about the title of the presentation is Debt to Downtime, the 5 phases of proactive IT management. I'm thrilled to be here to talk to you all today. I have been in the IT space for a little over 25 years and spent a lot of my time, actually the vast majority of my time, in the IT security space. I've been in network management, IT security, and compliance for several organizations, and I currently serve as the general manager at Burk I.T. and oversee our IT security practice. So I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us and to go over some of this information really briefly, and I'm not going to bore you with the details about our organization, but Burk has been around for almost 26 years, actually a little over 26 years, I believe. We are a managed service provider based in Kingsport, Tennessee. We have been in this space for a very long time. We've been working with financial institutions since our inception. We really got our start supporting AS400s and other mid-range systems for financial institutions and have grown the practice over time. Over the last 6 or 7 years, we've been focused almost exclusively in IT managed services, providing services as simple as advanced malware protection and patch management for organizations, all the way up to providing holistic IT support for financial institutions, medical practices, a variety of different organizations. We really work throughout the Southeast. We're based in Kingsport, Tennessee, and the most important thing that I can share with you about Burk is our mission statement, and I love our mission statement. Our goal, our whole purpose is to provide practical, secure IT results with our clients. We're not here to upsell, we're not here to oversell. We're here to look at an environment, help our clients understand what they need, and provide those needs in a very secure and proactive, practical way. So with that, the goal of our talk today is to talk about the difference between reactive IT and proactive IT. And reactive IT, as I'm sure many of you know, and I will say we a lot in this presentation, let me preface that, we work with a variety of financial institutions. I feel like I'm a part, that Burk is a part of their day-to-day operations. We are in the trenches with them. We're working through their audits. We're working through their compliance efforts. We're working in their day-to-day IT management. So a lot of the advice that I want to impart today is personal to me in that I believe it's the best approach and I believe it's what we're doing with a lot of our organizations. But whether or not you work with a managed service provider, everything we're going to talk about is relevant to your day-to-day operations. So when we talk about reactive IT, that's the part of IT that all of us frankly dread. That is that, in the trenches, there's a problem. We're having to react to an unexpected outage. We're fighting fires every day. Things are going on that we didn't expect. We're dealing with unbudgeted hardware or software needs. We're dealing with unplanned audit remediation because of findings that showed up in an exam or in a scan. It's the part of IT that gives practitioners and an organization a black eye. We didn't know there was a problem. We have to react to that. We have to fix that. We're having to deal with that downtime. We're having to deal with that additional expense. Whereas proactive IT really is the goal. That's where we all want to be in our day-to-day operations. We want to plan ahead. We want to know the types of problems we're going to have. We want to be able to fix something before the end user experiences that pain point and has to call. We want to have plans that are in place that are 3 and 5 year active and accurate for the organization. They're based on business need and business goal and not reacting to what an auditor's told us. We want to be able to be ahead of the curve. And that's really what I want to break down today is how can we stay ahead of the curve in 5 core areas of IT management. And the 5 areas that I want to talk about today are documenting your IT environment, monitoring your IT environment, planning your IT environment. That's not just the upfront planning, but the ongoing planning that we do. Security and compliance, which we all know is fundamental to every organization and specifically financial institutions. And then how do we train our people? What are the aspects of training and ongoing education and testing that are absolutely vital to what we do in terms of IT support? So let's look at these in terms of those reactive issues that we have today in these spaces, and we'll start with documenting the environment. So when a problem pops up, what do you have to do to understand what's going on? What do you have to do to discover the issue and dig in? We all probably went through the issue with Log4j in the last several months. Did you have a good understanding of where that could be deployed on your devices, what software it may affect, how long did it take you to dig in, understand that, figure out what the field of play was for that incident, what you needed to remediate, what you needed to fix? How well documented is your institutional knowledge? Do you have all of that stuff in one location, in one person in certain situations? If that key IT resource is away, can you still function as an organization? Is it all tied up in one person? Is it shared amongst multiple individuals? Is it in a repository that you can get to? Or are you really dependent upon that IT engineer, and if he or she is not available, then you're in the weeds. You don't know what you need to do. Or do you have the same problem with your IT provider? Do you have an IT provider that sends the same person or the same couple of people to your organization to support you on a regular basis? And if they're gone, if that one individual or a couple individuals aren't available, are you stuck? Do you have all your credentials? Do you have all your configurations? Do you know how to fix those outages and those problems? And then how well could you support yourself if you didn't have your key third parties and your key IT providers? These are questions that are very fundamental, and I'm hoping that everything that we talk about today are things that you've addressed and you're thinking about, but hopefully we can get stronger in these areas. And when it comes to documentation, the most important thing you can have is a complete set of documentation. It's got to go beyond just, do I have really good hardware and software inventories? I've got a great spreadsheet. I know what I have. If I buy new PCs, I put them on there. I try to remember to take the old ones off. Same way with my servers. I may keep up with my applications. You've got to step beyond that. You want to have systems where you have all of your information in a secure repository. You have multiple copies of that repository. You're collecting things like your system configurations, IP addressing, passwords, photographs. I don't know how many of you do this. This is probably the most effective tool that we use as an organization. I recommend everyone do it. Go take pictures. Go to your wiring closets and take a picture of each branch or your core data center or each rack in your data center, front and back, so that if you're working with someone on the remote end, you can pull up a photo and you can say, you see the third device down that is blue and has the Cisco label and it's got the blinking light that's about 2 inches over on the right side. That's the cable I need you to unplug. Photos can go a long way of helping you in terms of your documentation. Great diagrams fall into the same space. If you're dealing with an emergency or an outage, you have a diagram where you can lay out and say, here are my choke points. Here are the possible issues that I'm dealing with. Make sure all your compliance content, your policies and procedures all flow in to that documentation process. Get them in one location. Make sure if you're using an online resource, you also have an offline resource. And if you have just an offline resource, you're actually printing the paper, make sure you've got a repository somewhere that can survive a disaster. I mean, here's the great situation. Almost everyone in this room has a vault in multiple locations. Go put a copy in the vault. Send a copy home with key folks. Have a copy in the cloud. Have multiple ways to get to that information and secure it. Make sure if it's an online mechanism or even if it's a spreadsheet that you've got authentication against that resource. If it's online, make sure you've got multi-factor authentication against that resource. This is important information that you do not want to have stolen. Another thing that is absolutely vital is if you are using a tool, if you're using multiple tools to track your environment, make sure those tools are dynamic. Documentation can never be static. Your environment's not the same from one day to another. You're going to add computers, remove computers, add users, take away users, change passwords. Have systems in place to where your systems are automatically updated on a regular basis. Most of the folks in this room probably use some form of remote management and monitoring tool, some type of endpoint desktop management tool or server management tool. Make sure that tool is designed to be automatically rolled out when something new hits your network. You add a computer to a group policy, or have a group policy in place. When you add a computer to the domain, the tools roll out. And not just your documentation tools. Make sure it's feeding your malware protection or your AV solution. Make sure it's feeding all of those tools that you need consistent across your environment. Check it regularly. You should be doing cleanup and review at least on a quarterly basis because it just changes. And this works in every environment regardless of the business model. We have to do this in our office. It's very easy for there to be device creep. We'll get around to removing those later. I've pulled them out, but I may have to put them back. And the next thing you know, you're 2 or 3 years later, there's extra users, there's extra computers, there's extra things in your domain, and you don't know what you have. So it puts you in a very bad spot. And then periodically generate reports and look at them. And look at them outside of IT. Take them to your IT steering committees. Take them to your audit committees. Make sure you're tracking what you have. Take it to your financial committees that track your assets. And make sure that what they have on the books and what you have from an IT perspective line up. These things are very, very important. So let's talk about monitoring. And let me pause here real quick just to say, I'm intending to go through this fairly quickly so we can have Q&A at the end. So if you have questions, write them down. I'd be happy to talk through any of these points. Monitoring your environment. This is where we can also find ourselves in a little bit of a hole. Do you only find out something broke because the end user called? That's the biggest number one red flag is you have to wait for somebody to let you know something went down or something broke or something went offline. That's a key point. If you get compromised, are you going to find out before the world finds out? That's the fear that we all should live in terms of the cyber threat landscape that we operate in today, is we need to be ahead of that curve. If there is a vulnerability, if there's a compromise, you want to be the first to the fire. You need to have alerting and mechanisms to deal with that. And you need to make sure your incident response plan can deal with that. Are your network and system slowdowns in your environment more of a feeling, or are they a fact? Can you actually say my network is 5% slower today than it was yesterday? Can you actually say user such and such called from branch X and said, our teller system is really, really slow? Can you quantify that? You have the metrics to say, no, it's operating the way it needs to be, but there could be something else going on with this computer. It could be something going on with the network. These are very, very important things you need to work through. So how do you proactively do this? How do you proactively stay ahead of that monitoring curve? Take advantage of your endpoint monitoring solutions. Everybody should have some kind of agent to track their devices. Set up those trigger-based alerts. Make sure you know if there's a CPU spike on a server or a desktop. Make sure you know if a server is offline for more than 7 or 8 minutes. Make sure that you have hard drive space issues. That's something we tend to lose track of from time to time. Make sure you know if I'm at 95% and you need to clear up some page files or pull off some temporary internet files or whatever you need to do to keep that system operating. And make sure these alerts feed your ticketing system. Make sure you've got a record of the problem. Make sure you got the alert, and make sure there's a way to remediate the alert when somebody did it. Getting the alert's one thing. Getting some stuff in your inbox is great. You know it happened. But if you can't track that my support desk person A saw issue B and resolved it with task C, then you haven't really solved the problem. You just know you have a problem, you haven't fixed it. So what are some other things you can do? You've got to monitor your network. You've got to have a mechanism to say, when are my systems online and offline? When am I having spikes in bandwidth utilization? When am I having slowdowns at the branch level? Do I have rogue detection in place? Do I know if something new has been put on my network that could be causing a problem? Do I have rogue wireless detection if you have wireless in your environment? Bandwidth spikes based on defined thresholds versus the baseline. Most important word in that sentence is baseline. You've got to develop a baseline understanding of your network. My network operates at this level. This is my traditional throughput. This is what a spike looks like. This is what a slowdown looks like. If I know my baseline, then I know when I'm having problems and when I'm not having problems. But we get ahead of ourselves and don't really define the baseline. We just know I've got a lot of bandwidth and it should work. But we want to know how we operate on a day in, day out basis. Log management and correlation. You've got to bring all this monitoring data somewhere, and you need to correlate it. You've got to look at it and say, if I'm seeing this issue with a switch, and I see this issue on a firewall, and I have this activity on my domain controller, and I'm seeing these weird auths, this all points to a problem. Now, we do this traditionally with SIEM products. Either you have it in-house or you have it as a managed third-party service. You need to make sure that whatever you have, that it's a mechanism where it's staffed to be monitored, staffed to be resolved, staffed to be reviewed. One person cannot manage a SIEM. Frankly, 4 or 5 people traditionally can't manage a SIEM. SIEM data is managed in events per second, usually in hundreds or thousands of events per second. We can't keep up with that. You have to have a mechanism to correlate it, to eliminate the noise, get it down to focused events, and then react to those events. And it needs to feed things like firewall and internet activity, online network activity, dark web activity. Feed all of that monitoring resource into something that can correlate and tell you we're having a problem. And then most importantly, we all know that the FFIC and a variety of other compliance and regulatory bodies are telling us we have to keep that data for compliance and forensic purposes. You have to be able to go back when you have an incident, when you have a breach. It's never a matter of if. I know everybody's heard that statement, but it is not a matter of if. You will have a problem. Do you have the forensic records to go back and figure out what happened and why did it happen and how do we remediate it? So that's a very key point here. So if we go from monitoring, we have to plan our IT environment. We have to plan it successfully. We have to plan it in a way that makes sense for our organization. When you have to address growth, when you have to add a new virtual server because we're adding a new core system application, or we're adding a new function for HR, Did you plan for that? Do you know that you have enough virtual resources or physical resources? Do you have enough disks? Do you have enough room in your SAN? Can you allocate a new LUN? Can you do all of those things? Is it hardware that you put in your budget? Did you know about it? Did you plan for it? Do you deal with end-of-life applications and they catch you by surprise? Are you prepared to say, okay, I know that, I-11 is going end of life, in June. I've got a plan for that. I know that Office 2010, 2013 are going to have issues if I've got that version of Outlook in place, but I've got hosted Exchange. I have a plan for that. You have to have looked at this in terms of what works and what doesn't and built that plan around it. And too often, we all find ourselves reacting. Well, I forgot to track that. I didn't think about that. I know it's coming up, but I didn't write it down. This has to be part of your overall IT strategy. Are you and your budget prepared when you get an audit finding you weren't expected? We all see this on a regular basis when we deal with our examiners, we deal with our third-party auditors, that they're going to make recommendations. They're going to start talking about multi-factor authentication at every level. We're never going to see that go away. That's now standard. Do we have a plan to address that for our administrators, for our end users, for our Microsoft 365 environments, for our core applications? Is that on our radar? And most importantly, did you write your 3 to 5 year plan based on what your auditor said, or did you write it based on what your organization needs? That's probably the most important thing that I can bring up here is you have to build a plan focused on your organization, not in reaction to what you saw in an exam. That's where we find ourselves playing catch up. We find ourselves not thinking about business goals, but thinking about compliance concerns. And that doesn't do anyone any good. So how do you plan proactively? You run reports. You run reports consistently and you review them on a regular basis and you plan from them. Look at your backup and recovery points. Are you having success and failure issues? Look at your system usage logs. You should be able to run reports and say, am I seeing spikes in disk utilization? Am I seeing spikes in CPU? Am I seeing additional users have to sign on to the terminal server that we have set up for Compliance One or some other application we have in place? Look at your maintenance records. Make sure you have a mechanism to track your maintenance records. When are my firewalls going to go out of support? When are my servers and my SAN going to go out of support? When do I have to have a VMware renewal that's coming up for my virtual environment? Look at your patch management and your vulnerability management reports. Where am I having issues? Where am I having a hard time keeping up? Where do I have vulnerabilities that I haven't been able to remediate that I know are going to show up in an audit cycle? Where does that stand? And the system error reports, hopefully everyone has a mechanism through your endpoint management, your RMM tool, where you can say, these are my noisy devices. These are my computers that seem to have a lot of issues. They seem to generate a lot of errors. They seem to generate a lot of tickets related to my ticketing system. Am I having hardware failure? Is this device reaching its end of life? And then look at your annual budgets and your long-term plans. Make sure those things line up with your security and compliance requirements. Do I have everything I need to meet my FFIEC cybersecurity assessment requirements? Have I gone through the RSAT exercise and looked at my ransomware footprint and how I'm defending against that threat as an organization? Does my 3-year plan or my 5-year plan reflect those needs? Am I budgeting? Am I going to my IT steering committee or my audit committee or my executive management or board committee and say, here are the things we need and here's why. Here's what the FDIC is teaching us. Here's what NIST is teaching us. Here's what other government agencies are telling us about. Are they aligned with the business's goals? Are you looking at your long-term 3- and 5-year plans and saying, I know we want to grow into this space. I know we're going to have to update our ATMs. I know we want to enter a new market. I know we're going to look at ITMs as a technology, and I've built my infrastructure to support that. Are you following your hardware lifecycle reports? Do you know which PCs in your organization are 2 years old or less? Which PCs are 2 to 4 years old? Which PCs are older than 4 years? And the same way with your servers, so you can get into a cycle and not have that burden of, I got a problem, I got to replace 75 workstations this year. Instead of, I plan to do 15 a year for the next 5 years, and I've built that into my budget. Talk to your consultative resources. If there's anything you take from this slide, and this is not coming from a managed service provider who works with a lot of banks, I love that they talk to me. We talk to every one of our clients every quarter, period. We have a meeting. Where are you at? What do you need? What can we do to help you? Here's what we see coming down the road. Hopefully you have that resource and you're talking to those folks. Talk to your third-party auditors. Talk to those folks you write that $15,000, $20,000 check to every year to come do a holistic security assessment of your environment. Talk to them more than once a year. Ask them questions. What are you seeing in other organizations? And say, are there any trends that I need to know about? They love to talk to you. And they love to talk to you outside of that bubble because they know what's coming. They know what they can do to help you. So have those ongoing conversations. It doesn't have to be a once a year engagement. So let's talk about security and compliance. Now, preface here, this is my sweet spot. This is what I love. This is what I do a lot of. So if I get a little long-winded, I apologize. But I take security very seriously. I do a lot of work outside of work to help third parties, nonprofits. Security is important. We live in a very dangerous world. We live in a world where there are a variety of cyber threats. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but it's real. We're all going to deal with identity theft. We're all going to deal with data theft. We're all going to deal with issues that involve friends and family and children and aunts and uncles, and we're going to deal with it at the business level as well. So the things we talked about here are very important. Oh, look away there. Do you live in fear of that audit exam? Are you sitting there going, what are they going to find? What do I not know about? You know, what's going to show up on that third-party external scan or that internal scan that I didn't think about that I've got to now find a way to budget for? And if I do have to do it, do I have the bandwidth to fix it? Did I build enough cycles into our maintenance schedule to say, okay, we've got to replace our firewalls, or okay, we have to have NAC now. You know, we've got to have some kind of network access control, or okay, we now need some type of multi-factor authentication and soft tokens for all of our users because that's what they're telling us we need from an audit perspective. Have you thought about it? Are you prepared for it? What's the cost to you to implement that in terms of not just software and hardware, but resource hours? And can you manage that? Do you know you can survive a ransomware attack? Have you tested your backups? Do you know that, yes, if we have an issue, I can bring the system offline, I can restore it in X number of minutes, here's how much data we lost, here's the impact to the organization. Those are very important questions you need to have thought through and be able to answer. You know, I worked for a long time with an organization that I worked for a retail grocer for many, many years. And we actually talked about downtime in terms of actual cost. Do you know what the cost of your downtime is? Do you know if you're offline and your systems aren't available, what that costs the financial institution per hour? You know, in the retail grocery space, we managed our warehouse distribution. We lost $20,000 an hour if the warehouse was down, period. That was what we were losing because we couldn't ship groceries. Do you know what the cost is to the bank or to the credit union or the financial institution if you can't see customers, if you can't track your transactions, if you're having to dip into your default ATM withdrawals and your default purchase limits, and what that fraud level is and what that's going to do to you from a financial impact? These are important things. So if we talk about IT security, first and foremost, everybody knows this, you've got to patch. You absolutely have to patch. You have to do it inside a 30-day cycle. You can't let it spread out. It has to happen. You've got to do it. You've got to remediate. You've got to report on it, and then you have to remediate the report. So my automated systems ran. I patched everything according to the system. I went back and checked. These 3 computers had an issue. I found the issue. I fixed the issue. They're now fully patched. You've got to do that inside of a 30-day cycle. And it's got to be more than just Microsoft and third-party stuff. Yes, it's important that your browsers are up to date. Yes, it's important that Office is up to date and Windows 10 is up to date and Server 2019 is up to date. Excuse me. But you've also got to think about, are my printers up to date? Is my phone system up to date? Are my routers and switches up to date? Does my firewall have the latest firmware version that it needs? Have I thought about all of those things that are footholds and entry points into your networks? Because that's where the bad guys are going. I pick on printers all the time. Think about what a printer is. A printer is a relatively unintelligent device that has a network connection in your environment and a dump truck load of memory. It's the perfect place for a bad guy to land. No security, all the space in the world that I need, and it's connected to the network. And nobody monitors it. Have you thought about have I updated my firmware on my printers and my multifunction devices? Vulnerability management. You cannot rely on annual scans. We do it far too often. We say, well, the auditors are going to scan, we're going to know, we'll fix it, we'll be fine. Vulnerability management should be called vulnerability lifecycle management. We go from annual scans to we start doing it quarterly, to hopefully we get the remediation data where we can do it monthly, and then hopefully you can get to the point where you're doing it weekly or in real time. Because vulnerabilities happen all the time. We hear 0 day thrown around all the time. What is a 0-day vulnerability? It's something that's out in the wild and it's getting exploited and there's not a patch for it. So we have to be looking and knowing, because there could be things that you can't even fix, but the vulnerability can be known, so you can take that device offline, you can monitor it with your firewall, you can isolate it to a separate VLAN or to an air-gapped environment if you have to, but you only know that if you're regularly tracking your environment and scanning. And if you're scanning it and you're finding problems, you gotta fix your problems. You've gotta take that next step. You've gotta remediate. NOC, SOC, those types of monitoring services. I don't know how your organizations are structured. You may have an IT staff of 30 or 40 folks. If so, that's great. Hopefully there's 10 of them that are dedicated to IT security and they're doing this stuff for you on a daily basis. I dare say if I ask for a show of hands, nobody's gonna throw a hand up and say that's how our environment's structured. We don't have those resources. So look at the good third-party SOC and NOC resources that are out there and use them. Bad guys don't stop at 5 o'clock. We do, but they don't. We go home, they keep working. So even if you're getting great alerting, even if you've got a really good SIM in place, even if you're going to get an email that says, here's this problem and this problem and this problem, if it's 5 o'clock and you're not dealing with it till 8 o'clock the next morning, you just gave them half a day to have at it. And you just can't put yourself in that situation. So make sure there's active remediation that's going on for those types of threats. Multi-factor authentication. Yes, period, all systems, all the time. That's where we are, that's where we're going, it's not going away. The place you should start right now is if you have external third-party services, if you have hosted Exchange, if you have some flavor of Microsoft 365, where you're using Teams or OneDrive or SharePoint, make sure that your environment is configured that if an individual connects to that resource, to your organizational resource in the cloud, outside of your IP footprint. So in other words, if they're not coming from one of your public IPs inside the bank or inside the credit union or financial institution, if they're outside, they have to multi-factor authenticate, period. Now you can make that less burdensome because you can use tools, you can use stuff from IBM and Microsoft, like Microsoft Intune is a tool that we use quite a bit with our clients to say, okay, this is a trusted device, we've loaded a certificate on it, the certificate says this is trusted by the bank, it can authenticate without MFA because the certificate is the other factor. But at the end of the day, anyone outside of your organization, any connecting outside of your organization must multi-factor. Go from there to all of your domain administrators, system administrators, local administrators inside your environment should have to multi-factor authenticate, period. The credentials are simply too valuable. Go beyond that, where we're going, where third-party audit, state and federal assessment is going is multi-factor authentication for all users. So be prepared that in the next 18, 24, 36 months, that's going to be a requirement for your domain. Every user is going to have a second factor of authentication. Or we're going to be using biometrics, or we're going to be using some type of camera, or we're going to be using tokens like YubiKey or soft tokens on phones. We've got to get to that level. It's simply where we're at. Because at the end of the day, credentials are very easy to steal. We monitor the dark web for many of our clients, and it is just a fact of life that they're going to find your email address, they're going to find examples of a password associated with you as an individual, and they're going to attempt to brute force with that information. Multi-factor is how you defend against that. I'm going to pause 1 second and take a drink because I'm talking way too fast because I get excited about this. The other thing that I was saying, it's not on the screen, but I'll share this. Antivirus is dead. In my humble opinion, I think in the opinion of most IT security professionals, traditional signature-based AV can't protect you because there are simply too many threats that a definition has not been written for yet. So you have to have a solution in place on your endpoint. Either it's some type of VDR where you've got detection and response, or it's MDR, all the fun acronyms that are out there. But any way you want to look at it, you need a solution in place that's not signature-based, that has some form of AI-based heuristics involved. So we can look at behavior of the end user, look at behavior of the network, look at behavior of the device, look at behavior of the application, and say, I don't have a definition, but I know there's a problem here. There's something that needs to be quarantined, something that needs to be dealt with, and I'm going to send an alert to someone, and that someone needs to be watching that environment 24/7. That's where we are today because that's the threats that we face. We cannot trust signature-based solutions to provide that. I can tell you examples as a IT security practitioner, as a managed service provider, of at least 2 zero-day attacks in the last year that hit clients of ours. That the attack hit, we detected it, we dealt with it, and the actual signature definition did not hit virus total until later that night. The world didn't know it existed, and it had already hit our clients. That's where we are. That's the threat that we're having to deal with, that we have to be prepared to deal with. So that's where you have to approach your endpoint security. So let's talk about training our folks. This is an area that we lose sight of sometimes, but it is the absolute most important thing you can do from an IT security and an IT management perspective is make sure that your end users are properly trained. The number one entry point in any type of breach anywhere on the planet is the human. The days of bad guys sitting in a basement with their hoodie on, just beating away at a firewall, trying to break into your network are gone. They're socially engineering everybody they can get their hands on. They're making phone calls, they're sending well-crafted emails, they're picking on social media websites, they're finding a way to get the user to give them the information that they need. So you have to train your folks. And you have to train your folks and structure your HR environment to help your HR team deal with your folks in those situations. So if somebody does something wrong in your environment and something bad happens, if the only applicable response that you have is please don't do that again, then you haven't set up your training correctly. You've got to have mechanisms to say, here is the penalty if you do something wrong. Here is how we're going to retrain you to explain to you why you did something wrong and how you can get better. And here's how we're going to share that with the rest of our users to make sure they get better. Is your HR team armed with the information that they need to help address these issues? Is your IT policy requirements around user behavior and acceptable use and personal use of devices and web browsing requirements and all that stuff, is it in your documentation or is it in your policies and procedures? Have you educated your users? Have you educated them more than once? Have you required sign-off? So I've got a signature that says, yes, I recognize this is what I'm supposed to be doing, so that it's a mechanism HR can use to say, you've actually violated our policy. Yes, you knew about it. Here are the repercussions. If you have an incident, have you trained your team on how to respond to that incident? And that's more than, okay, we had a 30-minute session in our branch managers meeting to say, okay, we've got an incident response plan, call this number if something bad happens. You need to work through those scenarios, make sure they're armed, make sure they know how to respond, make sure they know who to inform, who to alert, what to document, what to do, so that you can be successful in that situation. So what does training look like from a proactive perspective? Very first thing here, social engineering. You've got to be doing phishing exercises and spear phishing exercises on a fairly regular basis. And what I mean by, I say focused and well-timed, what I mean is you can't do them all the time. Because if you do them all the time, if you do them every week or every month, people are going to grow numb to that. They're going to know that, okay, it's just a test, I don't need to worry about it, I don't need to think about it. You don't make any progress. You have to do them frequently enough that they're effective, but far enough apart to where they're a real gauge of where your end users are at in terms of understanding. They've got to be based on who's being targeted. So you should do general phishing testing, and then you should do spear phishing that targets your system administrators, that targets your institution executives, that targets the folks that have the data that the bad guys want, the folks that could be spoofed that will make the bad guys more effective. We've all heard the stories of, I'm pretending to be this CEO or this CFO or this COO, and I need you to go ahead and process this financial transaction because I'm on a cruise or I'm wherever I am. And we know those are all real world scenarios. And in the world we live in today, it's very easy to spoof those communications and make them look very, very real. So think about that from a testing or from a training perspective. Tabletop exercises. This cannot be we did a tabletop exercise this year, we checked the box, we're good to go. You actually have to work your way through your incident response scenarios. And it's got to be all of them. It's got to be your pandemic response. I know we all think we've got that down, by the way. We still can learn. We can still get better. We all live through it, but we're going to get better at it. But your pandemic scenarios, your active shooter scenarios, your cybersecurity breach scenarios, your natural disaster scenarios, State of Tennessee has been doing some great things in that space. They did an exercise for everybody in the state that covered a natural disaster in the middle of a core system breach, which is a real world scenario. That can happen. How to react to that. So think about those. Think about doing multiple topics a year. Think about doing them multiple times a year. Repeat them year over year to see if you got better. I can say this, I work with a lot of financial institutions, and the financial institution that I believe fared best in the COVID scenario that we all went through was an institution that did a pandemic exercise 3 years in a row. They did the same exercise, they had a plan, they went through it, they measured their gaps, they documented their lessons learned, they did it the next year, they got better, and they did it a third year in line with some other stuff. So when COVID hit, they had everything they needed. They didn't have a hard time finding hand sanitizer. They had masks. They knew how to move their employees around. They knew where they were going to segment folks. They never closed. They didn't have to do anything because they had a plan that walked them through all these scenarios. Here's how our drive-thrus are going to work. Here's how we're going to reshuffle operations to split departments up and make sure people are in different buildings so we don't have overlap. And it can cause problems. I've got a financial institution. I was supposed to be on site training their loan department tomorrow, I believe is right, Tyler. And they had to cancel because their entire loan team has COVID. They all went home. They're all isolating right now, so they couldn't do the training. And that is something that we're still dealing with. COVID's not gone. It's still an issue that we're going to deal with. We're still going to have to deal with how do we protect our folks. But it's not just COVID. This is active shooter. This is cyber threat. This is malware outbreak and breach. This is all of these things, natural disaster, power outage, all the problems that we have to plan for. And then make sure you're doing this in terms of your policy and procedure reviews. Make sure your employees are signing off on your policies and procedures beyond just that first time in onboarding. Your policies and procedures get updated every year, sometimes more than once a year. I know they do, you have to. The FDIC is going to ask, your third-party examiners or assessors are going to ask. Do your employees know about the changes? Do they know about what you've done? Do you have an updated signature? I mean, you probably have written a work from home policy in the last year or two that folks that have been with the organization for 20 years may have never read or signed. You have to make sure that you're reviewing your policies and procedures at least every year. You've got to train your folks. You've got to let them know what your environment looks like. You've got to talk through these things. Accurate and secure control of a complete set of institutional knowledge. You can't let it all be in the hands of one person. You can't let it all be, I've got a really good spreadsheet and we'll figure it out from there. You've got to have dynamic, up-to-date, secure knowledge about your environment that is individual neutral, that any engineer in your team can use, that any third party that supports you can use, that is spread out so that you do not have a single point of failure. And you know how to react, you know how to resolve problems, you know how to be proactive in terms of your environment. Monitoring that is trigger-based. You're getting trigger-based alerting. I have met a condition, I have a problem. I know what the baseline of my environment is. So this is a real problem. It's not just a perceived issue, and I can resolve it before the end user knows there's an issue. You're ahead of the curve. You're resolving this, you're shrinking your invested time, you're not losing a lot of downtime, you're not losing a lot of cycles for your staffing resources because of downtime. Clicker's one to stop. 3 to 5 year plan that is aligned with your business goals and your security and compliance requirements. You've got to get away from, the auditor said this, so this has got to feed what we do over the next 3 years. And be in a situation, these are the goals of our organization. This is how we view security and compliance for our organization. Here's our 3 year plan that feeds our 5 year plan that feeds the success of the organization. It's got to be dynamic. These are all living documents. These are all things that have to evolve with your organization. IT security that's based on continuous updates. You've got to update everything, not just some things. You've got to do it quickly. You've got to have proactive monitoring, and you've got to have a validation mechanism. So I've done all this stuff. I've patched, I've updated, I've done these things. How frequently am I scanning? How frequently am I validating what I've put in place? Do I have 24/7 monitoring of my environment? I know someone at 3 a.m. will be available to fix the problem when it happens, not 8 o'clock the next morning when I walk in the office, or in best case, 6:30 when I woke up and glanced at my cell phone. Multi-factor authentication whenever and wherever possible. Be planning for it for your core bank apps, be planning for it for your internal users. It's already there in a requirement. It's even a requirement. One of the things you've probably already seen is your cyber insurance is going to require you to have these things in place where they'll even issue a policy. So you've got to stay ahead of that curve. I didn't say this before, but this is the most important sentence that I will ever say to anyone in terms of how to approach this. You've probably heard this before, but it's worth stating again. Truly secure organizations, by definition, are always going to be compliant. You're never going to have any issues checking the boxes because you're actually secure. You're doing the things to keep your organization safe. Compliant organizations are not necessarily secure. I can do a lot of things to check a box and make an auditor happy. That doesn't mean the environment in which I operate is safe and secure. I've simply done the threshold. I haven't actually looked at my requirements and got it what it needs to be. Compliance is a great guideline. It's a great measure of where you are. It's not the end goal. Security is the end goal. Mitigating the issue is the end goal. Shrinking the scope of an outbreak is the end goal. If something bad happens, no. When something bad happens, it's going to affect as few devices as possible, as little data as possible, and I can recover as quickly as possible based on the size and complexity of my organization. That's the goal. Focused, ongoing training specific to the business and its team. Spearfishing training. Train the people that are going to be targeted. And think about who the targets are. I could add a dozen more examples. One of the things I try to tell folks is it's very easy in the world we live in today, thanks to social media, thanks to LinkedIn, thanks to Facebook and Instagram and all the other mechanisms out there. I know when someone gets a new job. I know when someone gets their first job. I know when someone gets their first job in banking. That becomes a target because they're probably not well trained. They probably don't know how important the data is. They probably don't know exactly what they should and shouldn't do. So it's not just your CEO that you need to worry about. It's not just your network administrator you need to worry about. You got to think about the new employees as well. So think about who you need to train and how you need to train them and how often you need to train them to make sure that they're not going to be socially engineered and you're not going to lose data. So with that, I'm going to stop talking for a second and let you think about any questions you have, but I want us to spend a little time. You can see my information's up here. Feel free, any questions you have that you don't think of or you think of after the fact, write down my email address. Be happy to respond. Virtualsweatervest.com, that's my personal, yes, I do wear sweater vest all the time, literally all the time. But it's my thing. I've been doing it for a long time. I've got a blog that I have out there. You're welcome to visit it. It's not the most up-to-date thing. I try to get something out there at least every month or two, but trying to share security news, tips, issues I've seen, information about Log4j and other vulnerabilities. We also, if you go to burkitc.com, we've got several videos and tips and tricks that we're uploading to help folks as well, but use those resources. But with that, what questions do you have? We covered a lot of ground, and we covered a lot of ground very quickly, so. Yes, ma'am.
Smart TVs.
Yes.
I had someone question about, because they can be connected to Wi-Fi and they can hack them just like refrigerators can as well.
They can.
How in the world have you seen any instances of that happening?
I've seen televisions that have been rooted and taken control of. I've seen malware and ransomware. I actually have seen ransomware on a smart TV, which is the funniest thing in the world. If you really want to watch Netflix, you're going to pay me X amount of Bitcoin. I mean, that's actually a thing, but it really does happen. So it is a real issue. It is something you need to take into account. Most of my financial institutions that I work with have TVs. Our office is riddled with smart TVs because we use them for signage and other things. You need to put them on separate networks. I mean, they need to be on if they're wireless, put them on a separate SSID. If they're wired, put them in a dedicated VLAN. Make sure they pass through your firewall separately. Make sure they're in a segment that's not connected to your internal network in any way, so there's no routable traffic there. So even if they are compromised, they can't get anywhere. But yes, I mean, there are real world security implications to any smart appliance. I mean, I joke, if you run a scan of my house on an IP scan, there's 40 or 50 IP connected devices in my house. One of them is my refrigerator. It tells me once a month if I need to change the air filter. It's great. But if it got compromised and it was not isolated properly, then it could also get to my wife's laptop and my kids' laptops and devices and everything else that we have. So you have to take into account those appliances at the business level and at the personal level. And one thing I would add to that, I didn't say this earlier, and I apologize, but when you're talking about training your folks, one of the best things you can do is make your training personal first and business second. Talk to exactly this conversation. Talk to your staff about, here's why cybersecurity is so important. Think about what can happen to you at home. Think about what can happen to your kids or your grandkids or your spouse or your loved ones. Think about what can happen to you and identity theft, and these are the threats that are out there. Now think about that on a larger scale for our business and see why that's so important. When you make it a personal issue and you say, okay, we need to apply this to the financial institution, it's much easier to get buy-in. It's much easier for people to say, okay, I'll take the extra 30 seconds to use the token and authenticate, or I understand why I can only use, the bank issued laptop and not the new cool Surface I bought over the weekend. It's a good way to get buy-in, make it personal, and then explain why it's business relevant. What else can I tell you?
Multi-factor authentication for like end users, where do y'all see in there mainly? Or is it kind of a different things as far as like soft tokens or apps or, I mean, we use Duo for like our administrative accounts and things like that. And I mean, it takes very little thought or effort. It's a really great product, but rolling that out to 300 plus employees, that gives me nightmares. So.
I understand. And I can tell you this, we've rolled it out for a couple of financial institutions across the board. So every user authenticating. We've done administrator accounts for dozens of folks. We've used lots of tools. We've used Duo. I think Duo is a great product. We've used a product from Kaseya called Passly. We've used some other tools. I think you have to be prepared to be flexible. It also depends on your institution's policies. I have a lot of financial institutions that don't allow like their tellers to have smartphones available because they don't want them doing things in off minutes and off time. So your phone's got to stay in your car. It's got to stay in the break room, or it's got to be wherever. So you lose that soft token tool.
Right.
So what we have seen and what we've deployed in a lot of situations, in fact, we can take this offline too. Tyler's deployed several of our organizations recently, but we usually do a combination for folks that have a smartphone that want to use a soft token. It's easier. That's great. You get the push notification. It can come to your watch or your phone or whatever you need to do. And then we're also using physical tokens. We've deployed YubiKey for some folks, so it's just put the key in, touch the key, you're good to go. And then we've also used random hardware keys that are third party. So we've seen all those scenarios. But it's usually you need at least two solutions because you may not have everybody with a smart device that can do that.
Yeah, I think that's a big flip.
Oh yeah, see that all the time. What else? Oh, and I didn't say this, but I think it goes without saying, you should never have any mechanism to connect to your environment remotely without multi-factor, period. End of story. Just can't. I don't care how good your VPN is. I don't care how complex your password requirements are. You've got to have a second token on every VPN, every remote laptop, everything you're doing in that space. It has to happen. And that's a hard and fast rule from the FFIEC cybersecurity guidance. Every FDIC auditor I know asks that question. You got to be there. So, all right. Well, if no one has any other questions, thank you very much for being here. Thank you for your time. If you have any questions later on, I'll be here through the vendor event this evening and hanging out at our booth. If you'd like to know anything more about Burk, come by and see us. We've got all kinds of good information. Be happy to share with you. Like I said, don't hesitate to take my information down, reach out, answer any questions we can, go from there. But thank you all very much.